The night in Los Angeles is like iron, cold and hard, with an imperceptible sharpness hidden in the darkness. The dampness of last night's rainstorm is still in the air. Mr. Brown looked out the window at the blackness of the night and always had the feeling that something was about to happen, and that thought had just ended when a knock came at the door. At the door was a young man, tall, with a thin face, standing straight. When he pulled out his police badge, Mr. Brown knew his hunch was right once again. "My name is James," the young policeman said. "I'm sorry to disturb you at this late hour." Old Pete, Mr. Brown's maid, came into the kitchen and brought out a plate of apple-filled pie. James, however, waved his hand in quick succession and said, "I need you to come with me to the police station." "Is it something I've done?" Mr. Brown narrowed his eyes, unable to think of anything illegal he'd done recently. "No, it's not you," James said. "Please come with me, this is important and you're the only one who can help us." The lights of the hover car were like two sharp swords piercing through the dark chest of the night, and the buildings around them were as silent as giants with blurred faces. Mr. Brown sat in the car, unable to think of anything that only a bad old man like himself could solve. But he wasn't repulsed by the feeling that he'd been so reclusive since he'd announced he was no longer making movies that he'd rarely been needed anymore. The police station arrived quickly. It was already late, but inside it was brightly lit, and several policemen stood anxiously at the door, and, seeing Mr. Brown get out of the car, rushed to meet him. "Hello, I'm the inspector, I'm in charge of this case." A fat man at the head introduced himself and said, "Hurry up and go in, this matter." A second later the consequences are unimaginable. What exactly happened? A murder case. Mr. Brown froze and explained, "I'm so old I can't even carry a cane, and I've been staying home too long to commit murder." Old Pete, my maid, can testify to that. "No, no, no, not you," James shook his head. "This is complicated to explain, you'll have to look at our footage first." The footage was in the archive room, kept so tightly that it required 3 genetic locks to open. James made hot coffee, Mr. Brown took it and took a shaky sip. To this day he still wasn't sure what had happened. The genetic locks were opened, the detective pressed the play button, and swish, flowing light immediately filled the room. "This is the video captured by the monitor last night, you should be careful, the content is a bit scary." The detective paused, then smiled to himself. "I almost forgot, you used to be a horror movie director, you shouldn't be scared." The holographic video enveloped everyone. Mr. Brown was in the middle of a rainy night, and the crackling rain fell down and through him, making huge splashes on the ground. No, more than a splash, even with Mr. Brown's dim vision, he could see the dark red liquid. The water was laced with blood. Blood was coming from a man who was struggling to crawl on the ground. God knows how many knives had been inflicted on him, his clothes were scattered into cloth, and wounds all over his body were exposed like brown fish scales. A foot stepped on his back and he fell heavily to the ground, never to rise again. The one who stepped on him was a black man with a blood-stained knife in his hand. The knife completed several jabs next, until there was no more sound from the man on the ground. The black man slowly wiped the blood off the knife, smiled at the monitor, and then lowered his head into the rainy night. Mr. Brown was taken aback, especially since the last time the man smiled the man was facing the monitor and thus looked like he was smiling at Mr. Brown. Despite the blurring of his face, the smile clearly harbored a demonic aura that permeated the room for a long time. "This man is so familiar." Mr. Brown picked his fingers. "In the last horror movie I made, Black Suit, the hero Mr. Crazy also wore a black suit, and his body type was very similar, and his style of acting. It's almost like he was carved out of a mold. That's why we're looking for you," the detective said. "Oh, do you think that someone is deliberately imitating a character in a movie to commit a murder?" Mr. Brown asked. In fact, this kind of thing was not rare. In the long history of crime, such as Bison Bill and Jack the Ripper, the crime methods had been imitated by later generations. Criminals could derive great satisfaction from the reenactment of classic cases, which, of course, often became the breakthrough that got them caught. But the inspector and James looked at each other, and the latter swallowed hard and spoke with difficulty. "I'm afraid that's not the case." "You're half right, the murderer is committing the crime, and it's true that it's the same technique as your movie. But he's not imitating. In fact, we have reason to believe that the killer is the hero of your horror movie himself. I know it's hard to understand, but please believe us, we didn't call you here at this late hour just to joke around. The detective traced his hand around the light. Please take a closer look at where this is. What the holographic video projected was a cramped alleyway with a crumbling billboard flickering next to it. Behind this alley is an illegal cloned organ trading center. In fact, that's the main murder scene, and we found 5 more bodies inside, all dead from the same technique. All 6 victims were technicians at the trading center. But that doesn't mean that the psychopathic murderer from my movie came out of the big screen and went on a killing spree in the real world, does it? Mr. Brown's eyes widened and he gasped. Yes, those can't, but the records of the experiments at the buy and sell center can. Not only do they clone organs, they clone real people. The inspector scratched his head and turned to James, explained that one to Mr. Brown, it's too complicated for me to remember. James nodded, actually I didn't get it, there's too many technical details in there. But it's something like this: they first created a program that disassembled and analyzed Mr. Crazy, the homicidal maniac from your movie, and added all of his personality factors. Then they wrote that shit into the genes of a clone cell, and then grew that cell directly into an adult. He thought for a moment and explained, I'm oversimplifying. In fact, our technicians were so excited when they went over the records of the experiments that they almost passed out. There are many technologies in here that are ahead of their time, such as the program that can analyze movie characters, and the ability to clone a person alive with a complete specified life history. Think about it, in that case, we would be able to resurrect many of the greats in history by simply inputting their life experiences, or bring dead relatives back to Earth. Even with such advanced technology nowadays, these things still seem like magic, but it really, really happens. Yeah, Mr. Brown sighed, the wrinkles on his face quivering like a centipede. But they didn't resurrect great men or pull loved ones back from the grave, they brought a demon straight out of the movies and down to Earth. They're all fans of your movies, and they especially like this black suit, so for the first experimental subject, they used it as source material. The inspector turned the hologram off, and light returned to the archive room, but it appeared fragile, as if at any moment it would be crushed by the darkness outside the room. Disaster struck the moment Mr. Crazy woke up, and it's scary to think that someone like that ran off into the outside world. Since you are the writer and director of that movie, we feel you know him better than anyone else. We hope you can assist us. Mr. Brown looked out the window in silence as the sky seemed to darken some more. In a movie theater in Los Angeles, 5 minutes before curtain, the audience was sitting down one by one. Excuse me, came a polite voice, will you move over? The boy who was making out with his girlfriend looked up and saw a man in a suit standing next to him. The suit was very elaborate, you could tell by the material that it was specially customized, except that the man had a messy cocktail head and a large bucket of popcorn in each hand, which was highly disproportionate to the suit. The man's face with a pleasing smile. The movie was about to start, and not wanting to delay, the boys moved their legs to allow the man to walk over. The man said thank you repeatedly and froze as he walked to the center of the seats. He pointed to the girl's seat and sounded a little timid, that. Can you help me get that movie ticket out of my pocket? The girl, who was planning to continue making out with the boy, sniffed impatiently and said, you can't get it yourself. The man looked at the popcorn in both hands and sounded a little timid, I'm not really comfortable. The girl only had to come over and put her hand into the man's suit pocket and felt the movie ticket. About to pull out the ticket, she suddenly touched the man's belt, on the side of his waist, which seemed to have some kind of hard, cold thing pinned to it. Would you hand it to me in front of my eyes so I can see it? The man spoke up and said, I seem to be in the wrong hall. The girl pulls out her movie ticket and hands it in front of the man's eyes. The man glanced at it, then twisted his head to look at the girl in the seat and said, I'm not in the wrong hall, so you should be sitting in the wrong one. I'm number 7 in row 6, the seat you're sitting in now. The boy shrugged, oh, that's right. Our seats were row 6, number 8 or 9. But my girlfriend has bad eyesight and couldn't see the screen sitting on the outside, so she switched with you. But. The man was a little embarrassed, weighing his words, but I'm used to sitting in the center, I have a better view. Uncle, just be kind. Seeing the original owner of her seat, the girl also collected impatience, petulantly shook her shoulders, just beginning to develop breasts in the dim light. Shook out an unspeakable temptation, you just sit outside, we will be grateful to you. She had experience with middle-aged men like this, and knew what positions would make their bodies harden and their wills soften. Sure enough, the man swallowed darkly, scratched his head, and said, okay then. The man had just taken seat 9 when the movie began. The lights receded like a tidal wave, and the movie theater, filled with dark heads. On the large, dull screen, letters flashed out, and with each letter, a typewriter click sounded in the screening room, not too softly, not too quickly, like a heartbeat. This movie is intended to expose the blackness and evil of human nature, dealing with ethical paradoxes, moral degradation and psychological insanity that are not accepted by ordinary people, and contains a great deal of gore, violence, sex and its related scenes. It contains a lot of gore, violence, sex and related scenes, and is not recommended for those who are weak-willed, timid, or have a desire for the goodness and beauty of human nature. There are 2 minutes before the start of the main movie, so the above crowd may take advantage of this time to leave and go to the counter for a refund. Not only did no one in the screening room get up and leave, but they got even more excited, sitting up straight and staring at the screen. This is the cinema's activity, called Horror a Week Tour, that is, the classic horror films focus on the reflection, so that the audience with special tastes to see an enjoyable. Boys are attracted to this gimmick, take his girlfriend to see a horror movie, hold her during the scare, and then she will let herself do it. Thinking about this, the boys smiled. At that moment, another man's voice came from beside him, sorry to interrupt again. This movie is rated PG-17, you guys aren't old enough for that, are you? The boy was shocked in his heart, he did borrow someone else's social security card to buy the ticket. He turned his head, looked at the man, and said, "We're both 18. Besides, what does this have to do with you? Hey, I don't want to mind my own business." The man waved his hand in a huff and shrank back. "I just wanted to remind you guys that this movie isn't like any other horror movie. The year it was made, it was too scary and too dark, resulting in it failing censorship and being banned from theaters. It wasn't until 5 years ago that it was allowed to be released in theaters, but it was only limited to North America, and many countries didn't even dare to introduce it. Isn't it just a movie?" The boy said indifferently, "Anyway, it's the characters are fake, and even if it's scary, it's only in the screen." "That's not necessarily true." The man laughed, "I suggest you go out now and stop watching this movie or something terrible might happen." The boy waved his hand impatiently, "Mind your own business." The girl put her finger up to her lips and said, "Shoo. The movie is starting, don't talk." With that, the boy and the man stopped talking and turned their heads toward the screen. On the wide screen, the words of the warning slowly faded away and a list of the movie makers began to be presented. But strangely, the name of the director, which appeared first, was mosaicked. At the sight, the man lowered his head, and in the darkness, came the sound of teeth grinding. Light, hoarse, and eerie. After a few seconds, the man looked up, whistled pleasantly, and placed the popcorn in his lap, chewing it as he watched. After the list of names was introduced, the screen suddenly turned blood red, and the entire screening room was reddened. In the curtain of blood flowed a flash of black, treacherous as a snake, twisting into 2 hideous words in the crimson. That was the title of the movie, Black Suit. Jim was a beautiful child, with silky blonde hair and blue eyes, and smart, too. Unfortunately, when Jim was 5 years old, a high fever struck him. After treatment, his temperature quickly returned to normal, but his brain was burned out and his intelligence was permanently stopped at the age of 5. Jim's father was a lawyer, always dressed in a sharp black suit, serious in front of people, but with a tendency to domestic violence. As Jim watched, his father abused his mother for 7 years. The father used to beat his mother until she was bruised and unconscious. And all this in front of Jim's face. When he was 12 years old, his father finally blundered into beating his mother to death, and to cover it up, he split her body and hid it in the basement. Jim happened to witness this. He snuck down into the basement and sat among the broken bodies, hoping that his mother would get up and play with him like she used to. But he didn't get what he wanted until the evening, so he peeled off his mother's face. When his father fell asleep, he always dreamed of his mother's ghost coming back for revenge. After being scared awake, he opened his eyes and was horrified to find in front of him the very same familiar, eerie smile. The father was so frightened that he shat and urinated, his body convulsed and he died suddenly on the spot. Jim stood in front of the bed and removed his mother's skin from her face. He looked at his father's twisted corpse and smiled dementedly for a long time. The police handled the bizarre case. Jim was sent to a sanitarium with other mentally handicapped people who had no guardians. Taking care of them was a fat nurse named Mary. At first, Mary is gentle and patient, caring for them in every way. But gradually, her true nature revealed itself as a pedophile. In the dead of night, she gathered the boys into a small room, stripped them naked, and got naked herself. She made the boys climb on top of her and perform extremely disgusting acts. Jim, with his angelic face, naturally became Mary's favorite. And at the age of 14, Jim overheard Mary smothering the boy in the next room alive. Jim cowered in fear, so the next time he got on top of Mary, he bit her throat. The nurses, who heard the screams, rushed over and banged on the door, only to see Mary's naked body, and a bloody Jim. The nurses sent Jim back to the mental hospital. He spends the next 5 years in there, dealing with all manner of psychotic lets, and becoming insane as well. The only thing that made Jim feel at ease was a cherry tree in the back garden of the hospital. Jim thought of it as his mother and sat under the tree every day, talking to his illusory mother and fantasizing about the gentle response he received from her. It was the only moment in his life when he felt warmth. But by the time he was 19, the asylum decided to overhaul it and felled the cherry tree. When Jim arrives in the back garden in the evening, he sees only the bare stump, and in his vision, the stump becomes the fragmented body of his mother. He slumped over the stump and wept bitterly. A doctor who was rushing off to an appointment came over to call him. He ignored it and continued to cry. The doctor got a little impatient and reached out and kicked Jim in the lower back a couple of times. Jim sobbed and stood up, ready to go back inside, but at that moment, he suddenly saw that under the doctor's white coat was a solid black suit. Long ago memories filled in again, like smoke. His father's hideousness covered his pupils. The doctor saw he wasn't moving and reached out to push. Jim suddenly turned and grabbed the doctor by the shoulders, tripping him over the stump, following with his knee dead center in the doctor's neck. It wasn't until the doctor lost his breath that Jim stood up and methodically removed the doctor's black suit and put it on himself. Next, Jim found the axe used to cut down the cherry tree in the larder. He carried the axe handle and walked slowly toward the ward. The other nurses saw the scene. They were horrified to find that Jim's eyes were no longer hooded, but they were not as clear as a normal person's, but were shrouded in a rich color of madness. Like a bloodthirsty beast, he coldly surveyed his prey with a low growl in his throat and a cold blade flowing from his sharp teeth. They were taken aback and asked in a trembling voice, "Jim, what are you doing carrying an axe? From now on, my name is no longer Jim." He stuck out his tongue, licked the cold blade of the axe, and said in a single word, "Please call me Mr. Crazy." Black Suit tells the story of this man named Mr. Crazy. He massacred an entire mental hospital, doctors, nurses, even patients, not a single one was spared. The whole 3 floors were overflowing with blood. After this, he fled the city and traveled the world to circulate his crimes. He used the world as a curtain, and blood as paint, painting his sins with abandon. Perhaps compensating for his long previous retardation, after leaving the asylum, he reached a breathtaking level of intelligence, playing the police for fools time and time again. But finally, a police officer of equal intelligence senses Mr. Crazy's motive. On the map, the cities where Mr. Crazy has committed bloodshed are connected by red lines, forming a big Chinese character. Mr. Crazy is aware of the danger, but still comes to New York. After a big battle, the police were killed and wounded everywhere. Mr. Crazy even killed the police officer who sensed his criminal traces. At the end of the movie, the gas explodes and Mr. Crazy disappears into the fire with countless lives. Just when one thinks the movie is over and one can breathe a sigh of relief from the shivering and holding of breath that has lasted for more than 2 hours, a figure suddenly rises from the ashes. The camera closes in, getting clearer and clearer, and finally settles on the figure's fire-damaged black suit. The movie is dark and depressing, and some of the shots are sickening. When that father opens his eyes, the screen suddenly jumps and the mother's ghastly face fills the screen, a shot that just freaks a lot of people out. Also, when Nurse Mary takes off her clothes, the fat nude body made with CG effects is almost like a mountain of flesh, which makes your stomach cramp when you look at it. Throughout the movie, the girls kept exclaiming and clutching the clothes of the boys next to them. Boys are no better, pale, several times are about to vomit out, if not to hold on in front of his girlfriend, I'm afraid to run out of the movie theater. But the man sitting outside, but a leisurely face, while watching the disgusting picture, while the popcorn into the mouth, chewing crunching sound. How are we supposed to watch the movie when you're eating so loudly? Near the end of the movie, the boy suddenly whipped his head around and said viciously to the man. He was intimidated by the movie, but he had a knack for saving face by picking on the timid older man next to him. The girl also turned her head to look over, and in the dim light, she suddenly noticed the man, wearing a black suit. I'm sorry," the man was embarrassed, and while apologizing, he put his hand into the suit and took out something. The boy was about to grunt, but suddenly dropped his head and collapsed softly in his seat. The girl touched the guy and there was no response. She snapped back to the hard, cold object she had touched next to her belt while pulling out the man's movie ticket for him. She was about to scream in alarm, but her fingertips suddenly felt like they had been stung by something, and a coldness seeped from her fingers into her bloodstream, swallowing all her strength. She lowered her head in a trance and saw a syringe inserted into her right index finger, as well as an eerie smile on the man's face. "You've been told something terrible could happen," the man chuckled lowly as he retrieved the syringe and inserted it into his belt. "How nice it would have been if you'd listened to the advice to leave." The movie came to an end, but it didn't matter anymore. The man had known how this movie was going to end. He whistled and left his seat. Behind him, both the boy and the girl were out of breath, resting softly against each other in what looked like an embrace. Outside, the air was cooler all of a sudden, and the man's suit hunted and bulged in the night breeze. He opened his arms and seemed to embrace the whole night. That's when the news projected on the sidewalk caught his attention. The following will broadcast a shocking news in Hollywood. Mr. Brown, the famous horror film director and the master of film who has been off for 20 years, recently announced that he will resume directing at the age of 70 to contribute new works for the majority of horror film fans. After the pretty hostess finished speaking, the screen jumped to Mr. Brown's face, and his voice was steady and strong. "Previously, I gave up my film career because I felt that my last film, Black Suit, was just a Hollywood industrial assembly line work, with no special features to speak of. To me, that was unforgivable, and I didn't even want my name to appear in the director's column. And now that I have better inspiration, I'm going to remake the movie and portray a darker, scarier, more chilling character. We'll see then." The hostess said, "In 3 days, Lionsgate Studios will hold a welcome dinner for Mr. Brown, and the remake will be specifically discussed then." A cold wind ran through the street, causing the man's disheveled hair to rustle. A smile lifted on his face, yet it was also as warm as the night wind. "Is that so, father?" The man chuckled heatedly. "Are you going to create a more perfect version of me?" 3. Beverly Hills was crowded with people and drinkers. Well-dressed Hollywood celebrities talked in the halls, waiters walked through with trays of wine, and an orchestra played lilting music in the corner. All of this fell into James' eyes in giant detail. So far, nothing suspicious. "Are you sure he's coming?" James frowned and whispered. "If he really is Mr. Crazy from my movie, then he'll show up. I'm going to remake Black Suit, and that's an insult to him, and there's no way he's going to sit around and do nothing about it." Mr. Brown lowered his eyebrows and shook his red wine, the multicolored lights flickering around the rim of his glass. "But there are so many people in formal wear here, he could easily blend in. Don't worry, we have agents all over the venue. If he shows up, he won't get away." As they were talking, a black stretch Cadillac landed on the front lawn of the hall. The car door opened and an obese man walked out. Everyone's gazes converged over being able to drive a car directly in on this kind of occasion. Even in the whole of Hollywood, there was only one person. "Hi, old Brown." The man walked straight towards Mr. Brown, perhaps because he was so enthusiastic that the flesh on his face was shaking. "It's been a long time." Mr. Brown responded, "Brewster, the last time I saw you, you were a young man working at the studio. 20 years have passed. I didn't expect you to become the CEO of Lionsgate Studios, the most powerful person in the entire Hollywood." Where, Proust wiped the sweat from his head and shook Mr. Brown's hand. Your return, is what Hollywood is most concerned about. On behalf of, I represent Lionsgate Studios, and I hope to be your distributor for this production, as in days gone by. Mr. Brown is a little embarrassed that he announced the remake of Black Suit just to draw Mr. Crazy out. He's too old, his disease hides in his bones like a bug, and it's hard enough to make movies. He was about to come out with the truth when Proust clinked his 2 wine glasses together and the crisp clinking sound traveled through the venue. This signaled that he had something to say, so everyone fell silent. James was surprised to find that Proust's legs were shaking. "First of all, welcome to." He craned his neck, the flesh on his face shaking even more. "Mr. Brown is a worthy director, in the business for decades, and has given and dedicated dozens of excellent works to us. He has made horror movies take a big step forward in the height of art, and the only person in the movie industry who can match him is Hitchcock. Everyone applauded. James looked around the room, everything was normal. Especially his retired work, Black Suit, is a movie history classic. He cleared his throat, a movie that I'm afraid even Old Man Brown himself can't top. Mr. Brown frowned, the creases on his face gathering, and whispers began around him. Proust was a smooth talker, traveling between the major powers in Hollywood, and had never said anything as inappropriate as what he was saying now. So, I think that announcing a remake of Black Suit is an extremely unwise decision. Proust's trembling infected his voice, and anyone could hear his cackle of chattering teeth. Mr. Brown took a step back and whispered to James, "Something's not right, be careful." James subconsciously put his hands on his waist and surveyed his surroundings, but there were no men in black suits approaching in his vision. Proust continued, because Mr. Crazy is the most successful character Old Brown has ever portrayed, perfect, beautiful, unrepeatable. He suddenly looked up and rushed the lawn shouting hoarsely, "I've done what you said, you mustn't detonate." Where he was gazing was the stretch Cadillac. It had been parked there silently, like a side of a rumbling black tomb, ever since he got out of Proust. James, with his sharp eyes, looked through the window and saw a man sitting in the driver's seat. The man was hidden in the darkness of the window, as blurry as a ghost, but upon closer inspection, he could still make out the black suit he wore. "That's him, Mr. Crazy, in the car." James instantly realized, yelling as he pulled out his gun. The detectives around the area moved immediately and surrounded towards the Cadillac. But before they could pounce, the car's hovering engine had been started, and with a hum, the car rose swiftly into the night sky, circling around the lawn for a week before heading toward the cluster of buildings that lined the perimeter. The detective reacted by rushing to the parking lot. A few minutes later, a flying car roared up and chased after the Cadillac in the direction it had disappeared. The heavy night sky swallowed the cars one by one. James, still uneasy, gripped his gun and looked around warily. Mr. Brown held on to the table, but his hands couldn't stop shaking for a moment before he said, "It's him, it's definitely Mr. Crazy. He's a creation of mine, there's no mistaking it. Don't worry, my colleagues have already gone after him, he definitely can't escape." Mr. Brown shook his head. Speaking back, James let out a long breath. "He's not as powerful and scary as in the movie. As soon as he was discovered, he immediately ran away in fear." Before the words left his mouth, Proust, who had been standing trembling in the middle of the living room, suddenly exploded, colorful blood and flesh blooming like flowers and drenching the entire hall. An actress watched as half a finger landed in her wine glass, loaded with blood, and she let out a scream and fainted. As Mr. Brown thought, the police did not pursue Mr. Crazy, who had robbed the Cadillac with premeditation. It was the latest model of levitation, with a powerful anti-gravity generator, and had dived into the cluster of high-rise buildings like a bird of prey hiding in the jungle. The police cars searched blindly like headless flies, and it took an hour and a half to find the Cadillac in the junkyard, but it was empty. There was a remote detonator in the car. Mr. Crazy pressed it as he fled, making Proust the grandest brightly colored flower at the dinner party. His premeditation wasn't just in the Cadillac, the inspector said bitterly, worry abounding in every wrinkle. The footage of him blowing Proust up was captured by at least 30 media outlets. By now, the internet has turned into a frenzy, and the police department's phones are all swamped. The chief definitely can't withstand such pressure, and I think that by tomorrow at the latest, the news of Mr. Crazy going from the movies to real life will be exposed. James asked, "Why would he do that? Wouldn't it be better for him to hide it?" "He wanted to prove to me." Mr. Brown looked disheveled, his creased gray lips quivering slightly. "He wanted to prove that he was the perfect crime character, that there couldn't possibly be anyone more terrifying than him. It's all my fault, I shouldn't have provoked him to come out. It's no use talking about it now. Since he has hit upon this idea, your position is no longer safe. From now on, you will be under our full protection. If he tries to harm you, he will certainly not be able to escape." The detective comforted. Didn't Proust get blown to bits in a ball full of detectives? Mr. Brown thought this without saying it. Hanging up the phone, old Pete looked worriedly at the sky. The night was thick, and there was a faint sound of thunder coming from the sky, as if a great beast were grunting in the sky. Mr. Brown said that something had happened in Beverly Hills and that he would not be able to return tonight. He instructed old Pete to keep the doors and windows closed, and that there might be rain during the night, and to pull the rain cover over the flower garden. Old Pete thought Mr. Brown was worrying too much. He could take care of this himself, he was a professional and had never let his employer down. When everything was in order, he went back to his room. Being old, sleep came late, and it took a long time in bed to let his mind drift a little. Outside, the thunder grew louder, interspersed with the sound of the wind, whistling and whistling, sometimes strong and sometimes faint in his ears. Toward the middle of the night, old Pete finally fell asleep. But it wasn't long before he was awakened by a violent noise. He opened his eyes and his vision was still lingering from the light of earlier. It turned out to be lightning and thunder. It seems Mr. Brown was right, a storm was coming. Another bolt of lightning lit up and a black figure was clearly visible outside the window. Who? Old Pete asked with trembling lips in fear. There was no response, and as he strained his ears to listen, he felt only that all sound outside had ceased, and the wind and thunder were hidden. Is it a hallucination? He muttered, as if to comfort himself. Lightning streaked across heaven and earth once more, and the world was bright as day. Now old Pete could see that only the branches of the great trees swayed outside the window. It always takes ages to see things. So he thought, and lay down again. But next he could not sleep, and tossed and turned in his bed. The room was dark, with only the sound of his own breathing rising and falling like the tide. Creak, came the sound of the living room door being opened. Old Pete's heart clenched again. He opened and closed that door a dozen times a day, and it was impossible to mishear it. He sat up, squeezed the covers with his left hand, and took out his pistol with his right hand from the bedside cabinet. Creak, came the sound of the hallway door being opened. Ta-ta-ta-ta. It was the sound of feet stamping on the hallway blanket. Someone was going up the stairs, unhurriedly, as if they were walking in their own home. But old Pete knew that whoever was coming up the stairs could not be Mr. Brown. He pulled the safety on his pistol and pointed it shakily at the bedroom door. The footsteps were approaching, but stopped when they reached the bedroom door. At that moment the lightning struck down, and old Pete could see the shadow of a pair of leather shoes under the doorway. Old Pete held his breath. Creak, the bedroom door was pushed open. Bang! Old Pete shuddered and pulled the trigger. Rumble! The long pent-up rain finally fell. The next day, the internet was really abuzz. Before Mr. Brown could get up, the door to his room was pushed open by James, who said eagerly, "You look online." It took Mr. Brown a long time to come back to reality from his slumber, a side effect of the years. James said it twice more before he heard, "Isn't this something we expected?" No. James' folding screen extended and quickly connected to the internet. The video of Proust being blown up did cause an uproar. But right now, the one with the most hits, is another video. Light and shadow flowed on the screen, and the image changed. In the cloudy vision, Mr. Brown saw someone familiar. It was old Pete. "Hey everyone," the screen shook a few times and a black figure stepped out of the side. "Do you recognize me?" The site of the video was a dimly lit house and everything was blurry. Mr. Brown, however, thought it looked familiar, and after careful identification, was shocked to find that it was the basement of his house. Old Pete was tied to a chair, so far away from the camera that all that could be seen was a little bright light flickering on his head. Oh, some of you may not recognize me, but horror movie fans will know me. My name is Mr. Crazy from Black Suit. I've got to tell you guys, it's a great movie, and it's amazing that IMDb only gave it an 8.5 out of 10, and the Oscars didn't offer a trophy with enough weight that year. Mr. Crazy walks around the basement haphazardly, seeing something, picking it up and looking at it, then throwing it on the floor, but now it's better. I think every one of you will know about this movie and will go see it. That's when you'll realize that I'm unsurpassed and even unrepeatable. He stood still, in the middle of the frame, and let out a laugh as harsh as scraping porcelain tiles. "Father," Mr. Crazy said softly, "are you watching?" "You must be watching. Then I want to tell you that everything I do is to make you proud of me. I am the most perfect character you have ever created. And to prove it, this month, I'm going to kill the one person you trust the most, the one person who can protect you, and yourself." Mr. Crazy's hand rose back and his body leaned forward in a standard nobleman's salute. "Farewell, father." He said goodbye in French. "This day will not be long." The camera then closed in, gradually sketching old Pete's figure into sharp focus. It was then that Mr. Brown could make out the little shining light on old Pete's head. It was the tip of a dagger blade coming out through the head. What a madman! James gritted his teeth and spoke harshly, despite having seen it several times. Mr. Brown covered his face and shook like a sieve. For the 20 years of his retirement, it had been old Pete who had looked after his upbringing, and the two had been called master and servant, but in reality they were close friends. And the monster that he himself had created, plunged a dagger through his head. Rest assured, he will not escape the law. James said, but it is imperative that we find out what Mr. Crazy's intentions are. Mr. Pete is the one person you trust the police to be able to protect you. That means that the next thing he wants to kill is the inspector or me if he is in a good mood. And you are his last target. So, you will be with us for the rest of the month. They walked out of the room together, and as soon as they opened the door, Mr. Brown froze. There were police officers standing outside the door. Each one wore a badge with LAPD on his chest and stood straight in the hallway outside the door, dressed in dark green police uniforms. They were silent, standing neatly and powerfully, and their faces were full of perseverance under the police caps. The inspector, standing at the front, took a step forward and said, "This is a major test for the police, the authority of the law, the preciousness of human life, the faith of the police, all challenged by a madman. This is intolerable. From now on, all LAPD officers will be in full pursuit of Mr. Crazy. No matter who it is, if they commit a crime, they must pay the price." Wow! All the police officers raised their hands in salute. Over the next few days, Mr. Brown watched Black Suit over and over many times with the detective and James. Every detail of the film, Mr. Crazy's habitual actions, everything he said. These were recorded and analyzed many times. Mr. Crazy is very characteristic, he takes pride in his craziness and always wears a black suit. The detective pointed to Mr. Crazy on the screen, so it's really not that hard to guard against him. With 10 days left in the month, we just need to keep an eye out for anyone in a suit that comes near. These days, they all traveled all together, always being careful of the people around them. But everything acted safe and sound, and it seemed as if Mr. Crazy had disappeared after posting that video. But Mr. Brown knew that Mr. Crazy was hibernating around him, somewhere unseen, like a snake sucking its teeth, waiting for an opportunity to devour him. A few days later, at noon, they went to the restaurant next to the police station for lunch. Before going in, James looked around the room. There weren't many customers in there, no one in black suits, even the waiters were in plain white overalls. "No problem," the inspector said. The three of them took their seats and ordered a few dishes. Within moments, the male waiter brought the food and then walked away with his head bowed. Just as he was about to eat, James suddenly caught a flash of black out of the corner of his eye. He subconsciously pressed Mr. Brown under the table while going to draw the gun on his waist and drank, "Watch out." Upon seeing the flash of black, however, he froze. A woman. That's right, at the intersection outside of the restaurant, there came a person in a solid black suit, and even though she was far away, she could see the curves rising and falling, and it was definitely not a man. Soon, behind her came some other people, all in black suits, walking by in the eyes of surprised passers-by. "Oh, it's a Mr. Crazy impersonation," the detective sighed in relief, picking up his coffee, avid fandom. Indeed, these people were fans of Black Suit. At first, the public didn't believe that Mr. Crazy had stepped off the big screen at all, and thought the two videos were a spoof. But then CNN reported the explosion in Beverly Hills, coupled with the acquiescence of the police, their attitudes began to change to two extremes. Some people were panicked and hid in their homes and did not come out. After all, just in the movie theaters alone there were people who were scared to death by Black Suit, and they did not dare to imagine what such a person would be like when he came to life. And there was also a part of the people, but they were very excited, and they purposely dressed up in the likeness of Mr. Crazy, and they were on the street crazy. The latter are mostly hippies, or horror movie fans, for whom Mr. Crazy is as sacred as a totem. Mr. Brown let out a long sigh. Facing those people outside, he didn't know whether to be happy about the popularity of his work or worried about the grotesque social climate. Better be careful, maybe the real Mr. Crazy is hiding in here. James still gripped his gun. Don't be too nervous, Mr. Crazy has committed several crimes at night, and now it's broad daylight, so he doesn't dare to do anything. If we're too scared, we'll disappoint the public. The inspector took a sip of his coffee, which was a bit bitter, and couldn't help but frown. He remembered something and looked up again. By the way, these days, colleagues from the institute have been reverse analyzing the instrument that duplicated Mr. Crazy, and the results are remarkable, so soon they will be able to figure out the entire process and principle. By then, certain flaws of Mr. Crazy might be known. Let's hope so. Mr. Brown picked up his knife and fork and cut the steak in front of him. He was too old for that, and when he wasn't paying attention, the dinner knife came off and fell to the floor. James called out to the maitre d', who was serving, "Waiter, bring another set of cutlery." As if he hadn't heard, the waiter bowed his head and walked towards the kitchen, leaving James with nothing more than his back. James was a bit puzzled and was about to mutter when he suddenly realized that the inspector was covering his throat and making a faint hissing sound. "Inspector, what's wrong with you?" The inspector's face had turned an ebony color, and was covered in a shadow of pain. He struggled to reach out his hand, pointing in the direction the male waiter had left, and said, "The coffee has poisoned him just, Mr. Crazy. I'll call an ambulance, you're fine," James said eagerly, pulling out his cell phone. The detective, however, smacked the phone away and said with difficulty, "Nanotoxin, it's useless. You chase him. Don't care. Fast." In just a moment's time, his entire body had been shrouded in a saucy purple color. James's heart was cold. Nanotoxin is the most violent poison researched by modern technology. Countless tiny nanomachines are hidden in coffee. As soon as they enter the human body, they will be activated and begin to crazily nibble all the organs of the human body. In all the cases involving nanopoisons, none of the poisoners were spared. He didn't delay for another half a second, pulling his leg and chasing after the kitchen. At the back door of the kitchen, the white shadow flashed and disappeared. James squeezed past the chefs at work, and when he reached the back doorway, all he saw was an empty alley. The wind blew and scraps of paper rolled in the alley, and James ran red-eyed to the end of the alley when a heel of wood suddenly swung from the side and hit him hard on the back of the head. A huge wave of dizziness hit him. He couldn't hold the gun and fell to the ground, but struggled as hard as he could to keep from passing out. A man stepped into his wavering vision, the very same waiter who had just escaped. "Hey, it's rude to greet someone with a wooden stick the first time you meet them." The man threw the stick away, apologizing all over his face. "You are Mr. Crazy?" asked James, trying to get up, but his limbs were limp. "Yes, I like that name, it's direct, powerful, and scary to anyone who hears it. But, yes, you're not wearing a black suit." Mr. Crazy froze, then burst out laughing as if he had heard the best joke ever. He covered his waist, and the more he laughed, the more he couldn't stop, and it took him a while to catch his breath and say, "Ha ha ha, who said I had to wear a black suit? Is it because the name of the movie is Black Suit or because I've never taken it off before? But I'm a lunatic, dear Mr. Officer, and a lunatic has the right to wear whatever he wants." James let out a muffled groan as he reached out and tried to pick the gun up off to the side. Mr. Crazy stepped forward and kicked the gun away and smiled. "A stick is rude enough, a gun is even ruder. We're all gentlemen, it's better to be conciliatory. I'll catch you if I die." "No, no, no, I don't want to kill you just yet." Mr. Crazy knelt down, straightened James's loose collar, and leaned in to whisper in his ear, "Tell father for me that there are 5 days until the end of the month, and that no matter what, I will take his life. These 5 days, fear and despair will follow him. He gave me a life of fear and despair, and I'm going to give it back to him." "You won't make it, you're crazy." Mr. Crazy shook his head slowly. "No, you're not crazy, so you don't understand my power, all of it comes from madness." He lifted James' neat collar and slammed it down, the massive impact causing James to fall into a complete stupor. It had been an incredibly long night. Mr. Brown sat alone in the deepest room of the men's central prison, and the ticking of the old-fashioned clock, one by one, reminded him of the passage of time. The peculiarly grim, rotting odor of the prison filled the small room, floating, lingering, as if trying to drive the old man from his own turf. Mr. Brown didn't want to be here either, but it was the safest place in all of New York City, and not even a heavy weapon like a photon shell could blast through the prison walls. Tonight was the end of the month, the deadline Mr. Crazy had spoken of. Outside the room, James gripped his gun tightly and pricked up his ears to listen for movement outside. Around him, the most highly qualified detectives in New York City, all armed. A little further out, hundreds of hovercrafts were parked, and at the first sign of movement, they would fill the sky like a swarm of bees. And for miles around the prison, plainclothes officers were placed on every street, keeping an eye out for anyone suspicious. Almost half of the police force of the city of Los Angeles was concentrated here. 2 of the 3 people Mr. Crazy had previously threatened to kill had already been killed, and one of them was also a prestigious detective in the police force. This has put the government under tremendous public pressure. With the election approaching, the president, unwilling to take the blame for incompetence and not wanting to jeopardize his re-election, gives his personal instructions that Mr. Brown must be protected. James's grip on the gun was seeping with sweat, and he had to tighten and loosen his grip to maintain the same rhythm as his breathing. Mr. Crazy's fearfulness he had already learned, but he couldn't imagine how Mr. Crazy would get his hands on him with such army-like protection. Tick-tock, tick-tock, the monotonous sound of the clock echoed in everyone's ears. It was 10 o'clock and still dead silent. Outside the prison, a large number of citizens had gathered, all of whom knew what was going to happen tonight and were both afraid and curious, watching from a short distance away. The police had to detach a group to disperse them. The crowd dispersed and gathered again a little further away, raising their cell phones to take pictures. The police didn't bother anymore, there was no need to spread out the force at a time of this urgency. By 11 o'clock, the night was deep and shadowy, the sky shrouded like a blackened potpourri. No stars, no moon, even the wind was frozen. The police had prepared for this, and with nearly 1,000 powerful lights turned on at the same time, the outside of the prison was visible. No one could take advantage of the darkness to get close. The crowd was getting nervous, and the hearts of the police were in their throats. In less than an hour, there was no suspicious movement, and everyone was wondering what Mr. Crazy would use to fulfill his promise. Like a Hollywood movie, there was enough build-up, just waiting for an ending that would surprise and amaze everyone. Tick-tock, tick-tock, only the hands were beating methodically. When the minute hand was almost pointing to 12, everyone held their breath. One of the detectives next to James couldn't help but count down in a whisper, 30, 29, 28. Mr. Brown sat in silence. His heart didn't steal with the approaching time. With Mr. Crazy's methods, he could have died himself even at the last second. 10, 9, 8. 3, 2. Mr. Brown closed his eyes and waited for his fate in absolute darkness. 1. A few seconds later, he opened his eyes and all was well. The police began to whisper, while the crowd gathered outside dispersed with curses. There had been no attack on Mr. Brown this night. Yet it was not a quiet night. Just after midnight, when all the police were relieved, the police institute was robbed. Because most of the police force in the city had been transferred to the vicinity of the prison, the police station was loosely guarded, and was easily breached by a group of men in black suits. When the police arrived, the door of the institute was open and the facilities inside were intact. The only thing that had disappeared was the cloning machine that had duplicated Mr. Crazy. The monitor shows that the person in charge is none other than Mr. Crazy. As it turns out, Mr. Crazy didn't intend to kill Mr. Brown at all. He was so high profile just to divert people's attention. In those days, he was not idle in the blind spot of the police's sight. He gathered a group of loyal followers. I'm so stupid. James smashed his head against the wall so hard upon hearing the news that blood quickly oozed from his forehead. He's clearly said himself that he's a madman, and I'm actually stupid enough to follow his train of thought. From the very beginning, his purpose was the cloning instrument, this kind of instrument, falling into his hands, the consequences. But he immediately perked up again. In the past, when he couldn't catch Mr. Crazy, it was all because he was alone and didn't leave clues. And now, he entangled more than a dozen people. Many people must have mixed mouths. As long as the leakage of a hint of wind, you can follow the vine to find Mr. Crazy. James immediately sent all of his informants out on the streets and alleys to ask for information. As long as that group of people came out, they would never be able to escape the ears of the informants. This was indeed the case. The next day, that group of people following Mr. Crazy was found. All of them were lying under the Golden Gate Bridge, the cold seawater turning their bodies a greenish-purple color. A few of them, eyes protruding, still had expressions of shock and fear lingering on their faces, as if they had been immersed in madness until the last moment before the shadow of death covered them. Since then, the search for Mr. Crazy had been completely cut off. He had disappeared without a word. 2 years later, in the south of France, in the small town of Sayre. Mr. Brown just woke up, the curtains were pulled open, and the brilliant sunlight immediately shone into the house. This is a rare old town in Europe, where you can't hear the noise of cars and horses, there is no pungent industrial exhaust, and everything is shrouded in the quiet time of the morning. The columns of light slant in through the windows, one by one, so pure that there is not the slightest dust mixed in. For the past 2 years, Mr. Brown has lived here, in peace and quiet. The initial trepidation had melted away like ice in the sun. He enjoyed such a heavenly small town life and even wondered why he hadn't thought of moving here before. After breakfast, he slowly strolled through the streets, the old buildings accompanying the old man. The passing townspeople greeted him. The town wasn't crowded, and after living there for a while, he knew everyone. Mr. Brown nodded with a smile in return. In the evening, he went to the town's senior citizens club. The people here loved literature and movies, and a dozen or so old people sat around, sharing with each other the good movies they had seen recently. Someone mentions a couple of horror movies Mr. Brown has made, but of course, they don't know that the director of the movie is sitting right in the middle of them. Finally, they recite poetry. The club breaks up as the night densifies the town. Because it was on the way, Mr. Brown went back with the train watchman, Old Gimli. "You've been here a while," Old Gimli scowled, keeping the November chill out of his coat. "How's it going, like it here?" Mr. Brown nodded. "It's probably the most peaceful time of my life. I used to be too busy making money, and when I got old and became a man, it felt a little more important to live than to survive. I'm glad the town can make you think that way." Old Gimli sighed. "It's a pity the young people don't think that way, they grow up and go out, Paris, New York, New Zealand. I've stayed here all my life, guarding the train station, and I haven't felt so bad about life. They'll understand when they come up in age." They said goodbye at the junction. Mr. Brown went home, and Old Gimli went to the station for his evening shift. An Ionic Light Railroad swept west of the town, and traveling on it, an intercontinental train. It was the town's only way to the bustling world, and many young men, lifting their bags and kissing their girls goodbye, stepped aboard for the colorful and treacherous metropolis. Only people leave, and very few get off. But tonight was an exception. The intercontinental train came into the station just after midnight. Old Gimli yawned and slowed down to take notes on his computer. At that moment, the sound of a man's footsteps approached from a distance. The ion engine train was silent as it started and moved, thus the footsteps were extraordinarily clear. There are still people coming at this late hour. Old Gimli thought and looked up to see. The station room was empty, the alloy walls glittering with a cold light, and a man walked in, his black suit looking particularly blinding. Lao Jinli was about to speak, but found that the import walked in another person. No, more than one, behind 5 people walked in. They have different body types, 5 men and 1 woman, but the same clothes, the same cold expression. 6 people in suits staggered in front of the window. Old Gimli was a little puzzled, and after thinking about it for a while, he realized that the reason he thought the footsteps were one person's was because these 6 people were walking in the exact same step, 6 leather shoes stepping down at the same time, 6 leather shoes dangling in the air at the same time, and making only one sound. "Excuse me, is this Sailor's Town?" The man at the head of the group approached, smiling gently. Well, Old Gimli was still lost in amazement. "Sailor Town welcomes you, are you here?" "Oh, we're here to see a relative." "Who?" "I know everyone in this town, I can tell you the address." Mr. Brown had a long overdue nightmare. The dream was dark, but the blackness of the whole night coalesced less than the clothes on the man's back. In his left and right hands he carried the heads of Old Pete and the inspector, respectively, and the heads dripped blood and showered the floor in 2 crooked rows. The eyes of the heads were still open, and the mouths were opening and closing, but there was no sound. Mr. Crazy came over to the man and rambled in a low voice, "Father, I'm your finest work, aren't I?" Mr. Brown awoke with a start, gasping for air. A cold sweat covered his forehead, and his white hair drooped limply. The street lamp passed through the window, and its orange-yellow light wound through the room, coloring the surfaces of the furniture with a faint glow. The peaceful sight calmed Mr. Brown a little, and, catching his breath, he closed his eyes with the intention of falling asleep again, only to open them again immediately. Something was wrong. Because of the need to save energy, the town streetlights were equipped with sensors, and the lights wouldn't come on if there were no people or cars. A dog barked outside the house, continuous and urgent, and it stood out in the night. Mr. Brown was relieved. Even though the sensing of the streetlights was intelligent, the barking was so intense that it could be mistaken for a human voice. After all this time, it's still suspicious, he said to himself, consoling himself. Woof woof woof. The barking stopped suddenly. Without warning, like a dagger cutting through all sound, a deathly silence pressed in. The streetlights were still on. Unable to sleep, Mr. Brown got up in his clothes and opened the door. In the dim light he saw 6 black figures. They stood scattered, one each in the streetlight, in the flower garden, in the far alley, in the near street, and on the fence and steps. They all stood straight, their feet drawn in javelin-like shadows by the streetlights. No more flukes, the man from the nightmare came into view, and bad enough, there was more than one. Father, it's been a long time. The man standing on the steps looked up. It was none other than the long-disappeared Mr. Crazy. It's been 2 years, are you doing well here? Oh, it should be fine, I spoke to the station watchman and he said you quite like it here. I'm so happy for you. Old Gimli. What have you done with him? Mr. Crazy smiled, you needn't worry. His face was covered in sincerity and his tone was soft, he went quietly and suffered little pain. Of course, this is thanks to Mississippi Poison who traveled with me. Oh, look where my manners went, I haven't even introduced you to them yet. Mr. Brown shivered and leaned helplessly against the door. He put a trembling hand behind his back, looking as if he were trying to brace himself, while his fingers fumbled and pressed the alarm hidden in the wall. Tick, a slight sound rang out, signaling that the town's police department had received the signal. Soon, police cars would surround the place. Mr. Crazy was about to introduce his companions and didn't seem to notice. He pointed to the man standing in the flower garden and said with a grin, this is Mr. Blood. He used to be a doctor, but likes to use a knife to cut open the arteries of his patients and let the blood spray all over the room. He carries 17 lives on his back. That number will double after tonight. Mr. Blood took off his hat, bowed respectfully toward Mr. Brown, and said, it is an honor to meet you. That one, hiding in the alley, is Mississippi Poison, who is a doctor of pharmacy, but has a taste for poisons, and once poisoned 152 people in the California State Hospital, for the sole purpose of testing a new drug. The honorable station watchman went to heaven painlessly after being kissed by her. So it is that the kiss of a beauty is always poisonous. The figure in the alley moved, but did not speak. This one, is called Mr. Boom. You don't look at his thin body, he carries explosives that can blow this town into flying dust. The main cleanup task tonight will be given to him. Bored under the streetlight is Mr. Knife, who is familiar with all kinds of knives, from pencil knives to Damascus knives, from scalpels to horse choppers. Of course, more people have died under his knife than the types of knives he is familiar with. Mr. Brown glanced into the distance, and there was a peaceful silence at the end of the road. And finally, there's Mr. Gunn. Mr. Crazy smiled unabashedly, but I'll spare you the introductions, you'll see what he can do after a while. The 5 men, spread out across Mr. Brown's field of vision like spectral ghosts. They are the helpers you got? Mr. Brown asked, pointing at them. You could say that, but I prefer to call them brothers and sisters. Brown understood at once, you built them with a cloner. Mr. Crazy had an extraordinarily exaggerated smile on his face like a child being praised by his teacher, ha ha ha, you guessed right. I've spent these 2 years learning about the cloning instrument. That is indeed transgenerational technology. After figuring it out, I built them. What I said about their experiences just now are just the settings of the cloning instrument, they haven't happened yet. But soon, those experiences will come true, and the world will know what they're capable of. But until then, I must show you, as I said, that I did everything to make you proud of me. It is God's job to create people at will, and you will be rewarded for robbing them. Then let retribution come to me. Mr. Crazy let out a wild yell, his face contorted with excitement. The roar spread far and wide, and several birds perched in the trees lifted their wings and circled with a clatter. Meanwhile, the sound of a whimpering police car finally rang out. Flashing headlights approached at the end of the road. Mr. Crazy, however, was not the least bit alarmed, and looked Mr. Brown in the eye and said, the fact that they showed up after 7 minutes and 38 seconds from the time you rang the alarm is an insult to the word efficiency. He turned his head to Mr. Gunn and raised his chin, over to you. Mr. Gunn nodded in silence and lifted his top to reveal 7 guns clipped to his belt. He drew 2 of them and narrowed his eyes, aiming them at the approaching police car. Bang bang bang. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet of the night. Birds were about to fall back to their branches, but they were startled by the sound of gunshots and fluttered upwards, disappearing completely into the dim night. As the gunshots died down, the sirens of the police cars stopped. All 4 police cars lost control, rushing from side to side and not stopping until they hit a wall, with no one inside climbing out. There are 17 police officers in this town, and Mr. Gunn fired a total of 11 shots. Mr. Crazy smiled with satisfaction. So, Father, you should know what kind of man he is, right? What do you, Mr. Brown's face turned ashen as he lost his count on the police. What the hell do you want? Oh, Father, don't be afraid, I won't hurt you. We are your children. Father. The other 5 whispered at the same time. But everyone in this town will die. You will watch the whole thing. Don't you make horror movies to explore how bad humanity is, and tonight, you will know the answer. Mr. Crazy spoke slowly, the light slanting so that half of his face was slimly visible, while the other half was buried in deep darkness. Do it. Mr. Bleed, Mr. Knife, Mississippi Poison, Mr. Boom, and Mr. Gunn turned around at the same time and walked towards the various streets of the town. 8. Mr. Brown did not wish to remember the events of that night. For a long time he couldn't see the color red whether it was pink or crimson without vomiting. James didn't press the issue either, waiting quietly. 2 years had passed and he was considerably more mature than before, with stubble on his chin that was dark and blue and deep in his eyes. He was also thinner than before, the flesh of his cheeks sinking in when he spoke. It was a week before Mr. Brown recovered and told in detail what had happened to Mr. Crazy with his 5 companions. So. James narrowed his eyes, the creases by his eyebrows overlapping like mounds. Why would he go through all that experience to clone someone else? He's the most dangerous criminal himself, why didn't he think to clone himself? He probably did it because of ego. When I first tried to lure him out by talking about remaking Black Suit, at a dinner party he borrowed Proust's words and said he couldn't be surpassed or even copied. So I don't think he would have allowed anyone to be as smart as him, even if it was himself. James was deep in thought. After a long moment, he looked up. Did you know that we reverse acquired that technology before Mr. Crazy grabbed the cloner? What do you mean? I mean, I have a way to deal with Mr. Crazy now that he won't do what he won't do, we'll do it. It was a rainy night, the whole of Los Angeles was shrouded in a watery haze, the tall buildings of Dasha were silent, and the neon couldn't tear through the heavy curtain of rain. The city seemed to be melting. The rain is so heavy that citizens are reluctant to go out, and the city that never sleeps shows signs of fatigue. Just after midnight, however, a stretch Lincoln drove up to the entrance of the sanatorium, the pavement pressed out by the wheels of 2 drainage walls. The doors on both sides of the car opened, and 3 people got down on each side. They had no umbrellas, and the clattering rain drenched the suits on them. This is the place. Mr. Crazy, who was standing at the front, said, it's a place of memories. The rain fell harder, and the ground withered and bloomed. Go on. The 5 men, except Mr. Crazy, walked towards the sanatorium in silence. The water on the street had pooled so deep that their leather shoes were filled with water, but their steps were in unison, like 5 precision machines. Mr. Crazy stood beside the car. The familiar appearance of the sanitarium aroused certain memories in him, the fat nurse, the strangled children. He tried to smoke a cigar, but it was wet with rain just as he took it out. He threw the cigar away and stomped on it with his leather shoes. He stood alone in the middle of the street. According to the estimation, it would take at least 5 minutes to slaughter the sanatorium. But after only 2 minutes, the 5 returned, and Mr. Blood came up to him stronger and whispered, "There's no one in the sanitarium." Mr. Crazy dug in his pockets and only pulled out gum that was soaked and wet and put it in his mouth, nodded and said, "They surrounded the place. Not a single pedestrian has passed by in the past 2 minutes just now. Don't worry, we'll protect you." When have I ever worried? Mr. Crazy smiled lowly, "I just don't know how they expected me to come here." At that moment, the sound of police beeping came from all directions, and over 50 speeding cars came out of the backs of the surrounding buildings, their headlights converging on the 6 men. Many loaded police officers also poured out from the side of the street, hiding behind cover and raising their guns to the center of the street. Looks like a real trap. Mr. Crazy shrugged. You all know what to do, right? The 5 men nodded. You are surrounded, drop your weapons in your hands immediately. A horn sounded from one of the speeders, there was a 2-second pause, and then it repeated, you are surrounded, stand. It was Mr. Gunn who fired, and the speeder, like a bird with a broken wing, fell headlong. Shoot, dead or alive. James ordered from the group of cops. Gunshots were fired. Mr. Crazy chewed his gum and bent down into the car. Bullets hit the roof of the car, clanking, and in that instant Mr. Kinfee was hit by at least 30 bullets and collapsed in a pool of water covered with bloody holes. The others weren't much better. Mr. Blood was hit in the leg, Mississippi Poison and Mr. Boom were both injured to varying degrees. But before Mississippi Poison got into the car, she threw a capsule towards the ground, and the walls of the capsule melted as soon as it rained, and the uncountable nanites inside swarmed out and swam through the water at lightning speed. The police, surrounded by the ground, were attacked by the nanites almost simultaneously, covering their legs and feet and wailing. The sound of gunfire immediately taunted a lot. When Mississippi Poison, Mr. Boom and Mr. Gunn got into the car, Mr. Crazy activated the car's hovering device. Mr. Blood struggled to get in as well, but the door was already closed, and he was alone and exposed to the gunfire, and a second later, he and Mr. Kinfee were lying together. Looking at his companion who was beaten into a mess, Mr. Crazy's expression didn't change at all. Mr. Gunn fired his gun towards the car window, and with every gunshot, a police speeder fell. And the Lincoln's military defense-grade roof blocked the vast majority of the attacks for them. Mr. Gunn focused his attack on the police car to the southeast, quickly opening a gap. The Lincoln dipped over, and the car's undercarriage was immediately attacked by the police on the ground. 2 bullets hit the engine, and the car shook for a moment, but still broke out of the police cars. Trying to arrest me? Mr. Crazy sneered while controlling the car. This is what you forced me to do. Next time, I'll bring more than 5 people. The moment before he disappeared between the buildings in the rain, he squinted and saw a scene on the ground. In the crowd of startled police officers, James was pulling at a man in a black suit. The man's hands were cuffed, but he had a smile on his face and raised his head in the direction Mr. Crazy had left. That attire, that expression, it's almost as if he's looking at himself in the mirror. The Lincoln jerked to a halt. What's going on? Mississippi Poison frowned. If we don't leave, it'll be too late. Mr. Crazy didn't say anything, biting his lip and tapping his fingers anxiously on the steering wheel. I'm going to kill someone, he said. They've cloned another me, and that's unforgivable. I'm going to kill him. With that, he glanced toward Mr. Boom, then maneuvered the Lincoln into a rapid climb. Mr. Boom nodded once, opened the car door, and jumped out. Before hitting the ground, he pressed the switch of the bomb on his body, and a loud roar engulfed everything around him. The rain quickly evaporated, and the pursuing police cars were lifted off the ground by the shockwave, crashing toy-like into the walls of the buildings on either side. Once the explosion subsided, Mr. Crazy lowered the height of his car and swooped over towards James. Look out! James shouted as he yanked the man in black to the back. The cops ignored the pain in their legs and raised their guns to fire. The Lincoln's undercarriage was instantly shot to a beehive. A bullet came through, burrowing into Mississippi Poison's left waist and immediately exiting through her right chest. Plasma splattered all over the car. Mr. Gunn's face was covered in his companion's blood, but he didn't wipe it and calmly aimed at the group of policemen. He pulled the trigger and the gun roared, but his arm didn't move. The bullet shot through the blood-filled air toward the black-clad man at James' side. James had already defended himself, pressing the man behind him while raising his gun to return fire. He shattered the window of the Lincoln and Mr. Gunn's right hand was shot through, but Mr. Gunn didn't even frown, immediately switching to shooting with his left hand. Bang bang bang. James only felt a lightness in his left hand. He turned his head back and sure enough, the man on his side was hit, covering his chest and falling to the ground, the usual wry smile on his face becoming cold and stiff. There. Mr. Crazy jerked the steering wheel and the Lincoln once again climbed against the rain. And by this time, the police cars were broken all over the place, and the cops were dead and wounded, no longer able to give chase. James was filled with grief and anger, roared, raised his gun and shot, but could only watch the Lincoln car in the rain screen more and more blurred. He had put a great deal of effort into this siege, but he didn't expect that under heavy siege, Mr. Crazy would still be able to break out all by force. A flying car suddenly rushed out from the slash and crashed hard into the Lincoln. The smile on Mr. Crazy's face finally froze. He twisted the steering wheel and tried to avoid it, but the car's chassis was heavily damaged and its reaction was sluggish. Through the broken window, he saw the driver in the opposite car before the huge jolt hit him. It was an old man, wrinkled and with drooping white hair, but the anger in his eyes could have scorched dry even the rain. "Father." Mr. Crazy seemed a little disbelieving. The two cars in the air collided and separated like marbles, tumbling in both directions to the ground. This time the impact was too much for even the Lincoln to withstand. The doors were deflated and the glass from the windows plunged right into Mr. Gunn's chest and abdomen. The man who never spoke, still clutching the gun in his hand, never breathed again. Mr. Crazy was also shaken enough to cough up several mouthfuls of blood. He struggled to kick open the car door and slowly climbed out, and just as he looked up, he saw the blackened muzzle of a gun pointed at his head. "Congratulations, ahem. You finally caught me after all." Mr. Crazy, his face covered in blood, looked up at James. This day came too late and at too great a cost. Mr. Crazy twisted his head to look at the black-clad body not far away. "This day would have come even later if you hadn't copied the other me. And only you knew you'd come to attack this sanitarium, where the scenes of Black Suit were set up. You're too cocky. If you hadn't come back to kill him, we still wouldn't have been able to stop you today." James took a deep breath. "Either way, it's over." "No, it's not over. The law doesn't have the death penalty these days. You take me back and there will still be a day between us." "The law doesn't, but I do." The first thing Mr. Brown saw when he woke up was the news that Mr. Crazy had been killed on the spot. "Everyone at the station knew that I shot Mr. Crazy when he was unresisting, but they didn't blame me and helped me round out the report." James sent him flowers. "Now this nightmare is finally over." "Yes, the nightmare is over, and the day is dawning." Mr. Brown reached out his hand and felt the sunlight coming in through the window, and in his old skin, he felt the warmth of a long-lost day running through his skin. "You got promoted?" It was a long time before Mr. Brown noticed that James' badge had changed. "Aha. Also, you made a big contribution this time." Duplicating another Mr. Crazy to speculate on his actions and using it as bait to hold him at bay is the kind of plan only you could come up with. Mr. Brown shook James' hand. "Congratulations. What's worth congratulating is the fact that that kind of crazy is finally dead and the world is safe." It was noon when they left the hospital and sunlight covered the entire hospital. Many of the patients were out sunbathing and a few children were playing badminton, the air being traced in clean white curves. The cozy scene made James smile. Buzzing. The cell phone vibrated. "What's wrong?" he asked. He escaped. On the other end of the line was a colleague from the bureau, his tone urgent. "Who, Mr. Crazy?" "Yes." "No way, I put his head through the wall myself." "Not that one, the other one. He was shot in the chest at the time, and all of us thought he was dead, but..." The phone fell out of James' hand and he could no longer hear the words that followed. He stared blankly at the bright sky. The sun was bright and the clouds were high and far away, but he shrank back on his arms and always felt cold all over.